ó hiú cédé na planala sa todhchaí agus fáinne bhí van fómhar. Tesa gon ghfuil moll agus moll ar na planna seo a ailsiú, runniu pracas dá leis an dhear rialtas agus an dhear ara, agus inis neamaidig feiceáil aon rud na cloinsin aon rud ón ara uair seo. So schools Taoiseach have been closed now since the 13th of March. Parents, teachers and students have been left in the dark ever since. We've had delay after delay. The previous government made a mess of things. We had promises and commitments from the previous minister that a comprehensive roadmap for the reopening of schools would be published. He changed his mind on numerous occasions, and a plan never emerged. Under the new minister, it's more of the same. No plan has materialised. But now we're just over 4 weeks from the traditional date of reopening schools. And as it stands, Taoiseach, schools don't know what's happening. Parents don't know what's happening. Students don't know what's happening. School transport operators don't know what's happening. Here in the Dáil, we don't know what's happening. And I would suspect that on your side of the House, you don't know what's happening either, based on the silence from the Minister for Education thus far. Tens of thousands of parents have no idea how their children are going back to school in September. I've no idea how my 4 kids are going back to school in September. My wife's a teacher. My 3 sisters are teachers. Like tens of thousands of other teachers, they don't know how they're going back to school in September. And they deserve clarity. They deserve, along with the thousands of other ancillary support staff across the state in our education system, they deserve clarity from the state. By the time you're talking about publishing your plan, we may be just 3 weeks out from reopening schools. And I get that some of this is complex. I understand all that and I appreciate that, but some of it isn't. We know that some of it's quite straightforward. We know that we will need additional teachers. We know that more money will be needed. We know that we need more space. We know that we'll need increased investment in cleaning and hygiene and other measures. We know that children will need buses to get to and from school, and we know that other children with additional needs will need to be catered for in this environment. The reality is, Taoiseach, that parents are really worried, they're stressed out, they're anxious in relation to this. And at this time, as is the norm, they're currently getting things together. School uniforms, mixed signals, will we need school uniforms or not, school bags, all of the rest. They're being contacted by Bus Éireann to say you now need to start paying your fees for school transport, not knowing how school transport will operate. They're being asked to pay for school books in the school. Many parents I'm speaking to simply don't have confidence that this government has the ability to get their kids back to school in September in a safe way. Okay, so I'm asking you to reassure them. I'm asking you, will you tell us and give us a commitment that all children will return to school on a 5-day-a-week basis from September? Can you tell us how many extra teachers are to be hired and when this recruitment will start? And can you give us some indication what is happening? Because parents need answers, students need answers, and teachers and school management need answers as well.
Taoiseach to respond.
I want to thank Deputy Doherty for raising this really important issue, and I know members from all parties in this House have taken a real interest in this very important matter. There are hundreds of thousands of parents across the country who are very concerned about this and want to know the details and want to know how their children will be able to go back to school at the end of the year. And of course there are over 1 million children and young people who need to get back to school at the end of August because they've lost 3 and 4 months of schooling, and that's not good for their education, not good for their development, not good for their socialisation. And while you might be able to make up for your 4 lost months, it'd be very hard to make up for losing more months beyond that, and that's why it's crucial and essential that we get the schools open at the beginning of the academic year at the end of August as planned. And that is the plan. Provided that the virus continues to be suppressed as it is now, that will happen. And a lot of work is being done by the Minister of Education, by the Department, by the teachers' unions, by principals and school partners to get everything in place that we need in place for the schools to open at the end of August. But we want to get all the details right before we share them widely, because what would undermine confidence is to come out with a set of details and plans today and then change them in a week's time or 10 days' time. So, we need a little bit of people bearing with us, at least for the next couple of days or couple of weeks while those plans are put in place. What I will say, though, is this. There are many other countries across Europe that have a higher incidence of the virus than us. Countries like Germany, for example, that have dealt with the pandemic very well, but as of today, and indeed for the last few months, have had a higher incidence of the virus than us. And they've been able to reopen their schools. There are other countries that have suffered much worse than us in this pandemic and never closed their schools fully. So I do think it would reflect very badly on us as politicians, on the government and on the education partners if we were unable to open our schools in August, when other countries that have suffered much worse than us didn't close them fully at all, or were able to reopen them back in June.
Taoiseach, you talked about that is the plan, but none of us have seen the plan. You've asked the people to bear with us for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. The reality is, Taoiseach, the public, the people have bared with you for the last 4 months since the schools have been closed. It is now just over 4 weeks until they are to open. So we need a bit of certainty. We appreciate that some of this might take a bit longer, but we need to know, for example, is the plan that all children, as you mentioned, nearly 1 million children, will return to education on a 5-day-a-week basis from the end of August, start of September? Is that the plan? Can you give that type of outline? Can you tell us how many teachers, a rough estimate, additional will need to be hired? And when is that process going to take? Because that isn't something that happens automatically. What is happening with school transport? Because bus operators don't know yet, the bills are coming in to parents and households. Can you give any indication that there will be no ban on school uniforms, for example, which are causing anxiety in relation to parents? Parents need these answers. They have waited for 4 months. They have heard your previous minister, Joe McHugh, stand with you at a podium saying that there would be a comprehensive plan by the end of June. It didn't materialise. They have listened to complete deafness from the Minister for Education, who has said nothing for the last number of weeks in relation to what is envisaged. So can you answer some very simple questions as to what is the principles of this plan, and particularly can you give certainty, if things remain the same in relation to the virus, that all children will return to school on a 5-day basis at the end of August?
Thanks very much, Deputy. We've learned a lot about this virus over the past few months, things that we didn't know back in March when the schools were closed. And one thing that we have seen from other parts of Europe and across the world is that while nothing is no risk, the risks that arise from opening schools are low. And that's why it should be done. And countries, as I mentioned, that have a higher instance of the virus than us, that have suffered worse than us in this pandemic, didn't close their schools fully. The schools were never fully closed north of the border, for example, and in other places like Germany, for example, which is a higher incidence of the virus than us, the schools opened in June. So, this is something that we have to do as a country and a society, and would reflect very badly on us if our schools were the only schools in Europe not to be open in September. So a lot of work is being done on this by the Minister of Education, by the Department, and with the education partners. What I don't want to do is to give detailed answers to questions only for those answers to change in a few days' time or a few weeks' time, because this is still evolving. But it's not true to say that there's no information out there. The interim public health advice from the HPSC has already been published, and that is the public health advice on what needs to be done in schools to make sure that they can open in a safe way. There's a lot of stakeholder engagement happening at the moment, which is crucial too. In relation to uniforms, the Department has received interim public health advice for educational settings provided by the HSPC, as I mentioned, and the advice focuses on keeping COVID-19 out of the schools and control measures to minimise the spread if introduced into schools. There's a particular emphasis on hand and respiratory hygiene and physical distancing measures. No issues from a public health perspective have been raised regarding children wearing school uniforms, so the normal policy for each school in respect of wearing uniforms will remain a matter for each school and each board of management. So there's no public health reason for any change of policy on uniforms. But as is always the case and was the case before COVID, that is a decision for boards of management.
Thanks, Taoiseach. Deputy Alan Kelly.
Taoiseach, yesterday evening, like I do most evenings when I'm in Dublin, I FaceTime my kids, Ava and Senan, who always have a number of questions for me, and they asked me last night, actually genuinely, they flummoxed me and said, will you find out if we're going back to school? Their mum, Regina, is a teacher. You know her, straight talking, she didn't know, so she said to ask her dad on FaceTime. It's critically important we get this right. It's the fulcrum around which all society is going to operate from a decision in late August, early September. It is the most important issue that you need to plan for and get right. Because parents, principals, teachers, nobody knows. Children don't know. And your Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, who is your Taoiseach, Taoiseach, said this is their #1 commitment. And I agree with him. But I'm not confident, and I say this genuinely, I'm not confident, given what I've seen from the Department of Education, from the Minister, that's going to happen. I know what Minister Harris announced recently in relation to guidance as regards third level and the funding, and I welcome it. But I also note his guidance. This is important, Count Corla, because his guidance speaks of a 2-metre distance requirement and a maximum of 2 hours in a class. Unions, principals, teachers, parents, all have noted this, because it's a precedent. Now, if that is the guidance, and that may be it, full stop, where does this leave the opening of schools? Because there are parameters set, and the Minister has not in any way answered any questions. The way in which Minister dealt with my colleague Aoife Reardon last week inside in this chamber was a disgrace. You have to be accountable as a minister. Hiding away in the department, doing briefings and then issuing press releases about it is not acceptable. So one question to you, Taoiseach, will you please ensure that the Minister comes in here next week and answers questions on education? That's surely not too big an ask. And please do that, because they're genuine questions, and the way in which my colleague who asked the question was treated last week was not acceptable. The questions people have in relation to school openings, in relation to how SNAs are going to operate, we can't treat them the way in which is being proposed. School transport, hygiene protocols, curriculum, books, materials. What about kids and teachers who are high risk, underlying illnesses? What happens if COVID does outbreak in a school? All of these are genuine questions. So I do want you to guarantee that schools will reopen fully in September. And I'm not talking about blended learning. If blended learning happens in September, it means that you, as a government, did not do your job. We need schools fully reopened. And also, Taoiseach, I want to secondly get a guarantee from you that the Minister will come into this House, which he's never done yet, to answer questions, because the people of Ireland need to know where we're going as regards schools reopening in 4 weeks' time. Thank you.
Taoiseach.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy Kelly. Give my regards to Regina and the kids, by the way. It's a long time since I've seen them. I'd say they are, yeah, at this stage. What age are they now?
10 and 8.
Time flies. Anyway, getting back to business, the Whip informs me that Minister Foley will be in the Dáil next week to answer questions, and will answer questions on this matter, and we'll be happy to do so. My view, if you look at it rationally, the shops are open, the restaurants are open, the hotels are open, the hairdressers, the barbers are open. The Dáil, albeit in unusual circumstances, is open and functioning. Many countries in Europe that suffered from COVID worse than us didn't close their schools fully at all. Many that suffered worse than us and have a higher incidence than us now opened their schools in June. So there's no good reason why we should be the only country in Europe that doesn't have its schools open at the end of August, at the start of the academic year. And that is what we're working towards, and that is the government's plan. But it won't be business as usual. It will be a new normal, or at least a new normal for a while. And we will have to make changes. And I think everyone appreciates that and understands that, whether it's around adaptations to the school buildings, whether it's around cleaning schedules, whether it's around how classes are organised, and how children are kept separated in smaller groups and pods. And that work needs to be done and needs to be completed. But it is something that I know the Minister, the Department and all of the education partners are working really hard on, because it is essential, provided that the virus stays suppressed, that the schools open, that parents have that assurance, and that children get back to education and get back to their social and educational development, which is so crucial.
Taoiseach Deputy Kelly.
Thank you, Taoiseach. I'm taking what you said to me as regards the Minister coming in to answer questions, not being the oral questions she's due to take on Thursday. That this is a separate question and answers piece in relation to the reopening of schools, which I think, in fairness, everybody in this House feels is necessary. So please, will you verify that? Taoiseach, the precedent set by Minister Harris in relation to 2 metres and in relation to classroom sizes has been set. Workers, teachers, people who work in third level, they can't be treated differently. So if there are issues in relation to how long people can spend inside rooms, and obviously there's the 2 metre issue, I just don't know how schools can reopen fully. And I'd like you to just answer that question. How can they reopen fully? And I look at the preparation for this. We're going to obviously have to have an education estimate brought in, because there's going to be changes, and very soon, given the amount of money that's been spent. And I did note, and this is just one example of a lack of planning, I did note that the department went out for a request for information as regards PPE, and the deadline was June the 24th. But no tender has gone out for educational supplies of PPE in this country. So if there's a lack of planning around how we're obviously going to need PPE no matter what way we approach the reopening of schools, it doesn't breed confidence that we're going to actually have the schools fully reopened. So how are we going to do it with the precedent that has been set by the other minister? And secondly, will you guarantee that the minister will come in and answer questions specific to reopening?
Thanks, Deputy Kelly.
Thanks, Deputy. The minister will be in the House next week taking oral questions, and I'm sure among those questions will be questions on school reopening. The Business Committee is giving consideration to an additional slot as well as that to deal specifically with this issue, and that's under consideration by the Business Committee. I think what Minister Harris produced the other day in terms of third level reopening is very welcome. It paints a pathway by which colleges and ITs and further education can reopen in the autumn. But I think we need to appreciate that we will have different solutions for different sectors. Childcare and creches are open. They're not all open, but they are open, and they came back at the end of June, I think it was the end of June. We were concerned that we'd have more difficulties than actually arose, and that sector has done a really good job in terms of reopening, in my view, and there are particular arrangements for childcare that are particular to childcare. The same applies, for example, in restaurants and hospitality, where there are particular guidelines for those places, and paediatric healthcare never stopped. Our paediatricians continued to work throughout the pandemic and have done a really fabulous job there. So I have no doubt that our teachers will rise to the challenge. The paediatricians never stopped doing their job. Childcare workers came back and have done a great job, and I have every confidence that teachers will rise to the challenge and make sure that schools are open.
Thanks, Taoiseach. Deputy Catherine Murphy.
Taoiseach, I too want to raise the issue of the return to schools. We know that and the reopening in September, it's only about 4 weeks, 5 weeks away before that happens, and I certainly am hearing a sense of panic from parents and questions coming from teachers. Obviously, we've known that the aim has been to return the schools in September for some considerable time now. It's how that happens. We know that youngsters have missed out on play-based learning. We know that they're key building blocks in terms of their social and learning skills. We know children that are going into secondary school have missed the events that were the rite of passage. There's things that have been lost. But it's where we go to from here, and recognising that it has to be done safely. But there is no clear picture emerging. My colleague Deputy Gannon with others met Minister Foley earlier last week. The meeting didn't provide one single piece of reassurance. There was no clarity whatsoever on what's on offer. But then there was a press statement very quickly afterwards saying that there was a broad briefing. There wasn't. And I raised it at the Business Committee today that there would be a slot next week. I feel we got a reassurance that there would be a debate And I see the Deputy Whip there, that I felt we got a reassurance on that. And I hope that that is the case, because we've already had that discussion. There's a framework document sitting on the Department's Education website, and I've no doubt there's an aspiration to open schools, but an aspiration will not cut the mustard. We have to see the details, and we can see this auditorium and what it takes to socially distance, for example. And you're looking at classrooms where there are 32 children, where there's SNAs, where there's a teacher, and you can see that they're tight even in the best of times. Are there additional teachers going to be brought in? Are you looking imaginatively at other facilities and locations that could be used, like, you know, sports halls and things like that could get our schools back? Are we talking about the schools being fully back? Are we talking about, can you specify in relation to people being partially back? And we were looking at people, parents, who are full-time carers, who are full-time at work, who are full-time educators now, and they are at breaking point. We need information as well about what if there are outbreaks in schools, how will that be handled? There's so many details that we need to know about in relation to how this is going to happen and what is the optimum of what we can expect.
Tánaiste.
Thanks again, Deputy. I'm not sure if there's much I can add to my previous replies, other than to say that, yes, additional teachers will be required. And space will need to be used differently. So, for example, space like libraries, general purpose rooms, gyms may be used in addition to classrooms. Stakeholder engagement at the moment is strongly focused on the shape and design of solutions that are both workable and supported by sufficient and appropriately targeted resources. Draft COVID-19 plans for both primary and post-primary schools, with details on a range of practical actions to allow schools to reopen safely, are being progressed through the work of all stakeholders. The procurement process is underway for a framework which will be provided to schools to draw down any additional equipment or cleaning products needed. A considerable financial support package to assist schools in reopening is currently being planned by Government, and further details will be announced shortly. There will also be a comprehensive communication with students and parents in advance of reopening, so that they're fully informed as to what the new school environment is going to look like.
Thanks, Tánaiste. Deputy Murphy.
Tánaiste, you rightly say about what is happening in other countries. But if you look at other countries, we're not the same as them. We have very high class sizes. And in some parts of the country, you know, 32 is the norm. And 32 in buildings that weren't designed for the new curriculum in many cases. So we're not talking like with like here. And we are going to have to be imaginative about other locations within communities that could be used. Now, like funding for additional teachers, funding for example, the kind of, you know, things like, for example, the means of washing your hands. I mean, we go on about the importance of, you know, the kind of etiquette that's required, the social distancing, about washing hands. You have to have the ability to do that. That can't be, schools can't be told that the week before they open. There has to be a degree of information, and that's going to cost money. Now, if it's a question we've got to sit here late next week and we've to deal with a budget for that, we will do that, because we can't go into September without that being in place, and it requires time to put it in place. Will we get those kind of details next week? Because if we don't, we're going to spend the full month of August with people rightly clamouring for this Dáil to be back, to deal with this, to get the children back to school.
Thanks very much, Deputy. I can't say for certain whether you'll get them next week or not, but the Minister for Education will be here next week and will be able to answer questions, and I'm sure is more up to date than I am on the issue of school reopening. We have learned a lot in the last few months about this virus. We don't know everything about it yet by any means, but we have learned a lot. And we have learned, for example, that opening schools is on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of risk. And NEFIT has been clear about that, and the science backs that up, and that's significant. This virus does affect children. but not as severely as it affects adults, and they aren't super spreaders in the way they can be with influenza. So we know that opening schools is at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of risk. We know that we've been able to open childcare. We know that paediatrics has continued to function, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to return to schools opening at the end of August, indeed as they have opened in other countries that have a higher incidence of the virus than we do, like Germany, for example, where they opened in June, or even before that, France, for example. But it won't be the same. It will be different. It will be new normal, or at least a new normal for the duration of this pandemic. And I understand that parents want to know what that looks like, and they want that information, and they deserve that information, and we'll share that as soon as we have it. But we want to make sure the information is right. Mixed messages and changing messages, we'll all appreciate, isn't a good communication strategy. So we want to get it right, and then make sure that the information is out there in good time and is clear and doesn't change.
Thanks, Taoiseach. Fourth question, regional group, so it's Deputy Michael Berry.
Gurmagat, Coherlic, and good afternoon, Taoiseach. Taoiseach, I'd like to raise some defence matters with you this afternoon, if I may. I think there's almost universal acceptance now that there is a severe and worsening staff retention issue in the Defence Forces. All we have to do is look at the naval base in Cork today. There's 2 naval ships and they're tied up at the moment, and they're unable to put to sea because there isn't enough sailors to crew them. I've also been reliably informed that a further 2 additional ships will be tied up by year end. So 4 ships, almost half the fleet, will be at anchor, unable to put to sea, just on the eve of perhaps a very hard Brexit. I think if this was to happen in any other EU country, I suspect heads would roll, because EU countries, they value their sovereignty and they take their obligations to police their territorial waters very, very seriously. So I think this is an issue that requires urgent action. Now, while I've pointed out the problems, I should also say that there are reasons to be hopeful and almost cheerful, because having interacted with the new Taoiseach and the new Minister for Defence over the last number of weeks, I do detect a genuine and sincere shift in attitude towards solving this problem. But we really need to focus on it. It would also be remiss of me were I not to highlight the support we've got from the opposition benches as well. I do believe that there's cross-party support to fix this issue, and it's almost consensus at this stage. So my 2 questions to the Taoiseach would be this. The Minister for Defence, Simon Coveney, is on record to suggest that there's going to be a suite or a package of financial measures brought to Cabinet sometime over the summer to alleviate this issue. And I would be grateful if the Taoiseach could indicate approximately when will this take place. The second issue I would like to raise is in relation to the budget, which I'll discuss the next time I stand. Thank you very much.
You, Deputy Berry.
I want to thank Deputy Berry for his question and his ongoing interest and commitment to matters related to the Defence Forces. And it is true that we have an enormous recruitment and retention challenge in our Defence Forces, and have had that now for a long time, really 5 or 6 years, if not longer at this stage. And it's something that we've struggled to deal with. Recruitment isn't so bad, but retention is a real difficulty. You want to have a reasonably high turnover in your Defence Forces, but the turnover rate in Ireland is much higher than in other jurisdictions, and we're not able to keep people in the Defence Forces, often because they're very capable, very qualified people and go on to much better jobs in other sectors, in the private sector. And we need to do more to encourage them to stay with us and to stay on. And it is something that I know Minister Coveney and the Taoiseach are committed to dealing with. With regard to ships being tied up, unfortunately it's not that unusual in other countries. I understand the Royal Navy at any given time is only able to send about half of its ships out to sea, and naval life is not easy, and European countries all struggle to recruit seamen and other naval service people, but that's not a justification. The fact that it's a problem in other countries as well doesn't make it okay. Actions have been taken. There has been considerable pay restoration for members of the Defence Forces in line with public sector pay increases for the past couple of years. Pay bottomed out around 2013. It's actually been rising consistently since then, in line with public pay restoration across the public service. And also there was a package of increased allowances for members of the Defence Forces, which was implemented a couple of months ago. In relation to any further package, that's something I know that the Minister of Defence is working on, but I don't have the details of that myself, and I'm not sure exactly when it will be brought to Cabinet. There are some difficulties around this. We do want to do it, by the way, but there are difficulties that arise around this, as people will know from the House that we passed legislation in this House to reverse FEMPI and to underpin the existing public sector stability arrangement for all public servants, and any pay increases in basic pay or even general allowances that are outside the public sector stability agreement and are outside a ruling of the Labour Court can't be done by the government. They would require legislation in this House, and there would be knock-on claims, I imagine. I doubt members of this House would be willing to say that nobody else in the public service has a legitimate claim either, so that has to be borne in mind.
Deputy Berry.
Thank you, Taoiseach, for that clarification. My second follow-up question is in relation to the defence vote or the defence budget. We already have the smallest defence budget in the European Union based on percentage of GDP. My issue is compounding that. There's been a practice in recent years where significant sums of defence vote monies have been returned to the central exchequer at year-end, and which is making the problem even worse. And I know that the size of that fund depends on your interpretation of it. And I'm particularly concerned this year because most of the deputies here will know that we have voted through a lot of revised estimates for nearly all the other government departments in the last few weeks, with the notable exception of defence. And I would deduce from that the defence vote expenditure hasn't even reached probably 70 or 80% of the threshold yet, and my concern is there's going to be a significant sum of money unspent at the end of the year. So I guess my question to the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach is this: could he provide any reassurance or any suggestion that all the monies given to the defence vote at the start of this year will be used for its intended purpose and none will be handed back unspent at the end of the year?
Thank you very much, Dr. Berry. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. There's a long-standing myth, and I'll be polite in using the term myth, that the Department of Defence hands back millions of euros every year to the central exchequer. I don't know whether it's an error or whether it's mischief on the part of those who continue to repeat it. It's not true. It is the case that money is reallocated from one part of the defence vote to the other. That's pretty normal. Anyone who's been here long enough or has run a government department knows that you will often move money from one part of your budget to the other, and that is done. Sometimes money is moved from the pay budget to pensions. Sometimes money is moved from the pay and pensions budget to buy new equipment or to improve barracks and so on. But overall, the Department of Defence almost always spends all of its budget. So the budget back in 2014, for example, was 900 million. That year, 100,000 was handed back. It was 900 million the following year, 400,000 handed back. 905 million the year after that, 100,000 handed back. In 2017, the budget went up to 921 million, just under a million handed back. In 2018, the budget went up to 946 million, 2.7 million handed back. And last year, the budget for the first time in a very long time was more than £1 billion, and 100 grand was handed back. So if you take all those years in the round, roughly the department hands back 0.08% of its funding. So this idea that the department in any year, in any recent times, has handed back lots of money to the department is false. But money is reallocated from one budget line to the other within defence very regularly.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. That concludes Leaders' Questions. We move now to questions on promised legislation. Again, today we have 30 minutes. 39 deputies have indicated. Deputy Pearse Doherty.
Taoiseach, on Tuesday I was very glad to see that you agreed with my own view when a spokesperson said on your behalf that if the travel advice for countries on the green list isn't different to advice of other countries, then we would be better off not having a green list at all. I must say fair play to you. But on Tuesday night the government agreed the opposite. You gave the green light to go and then said don't go. the advice from government remains not to travel except in essential circumstances. Last night, Ryanair sent a notification to thousands of people right across the state, and it said you've got the green light to fly to Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Malta and more, and offer cheap flights. I wonder if you've seen it, Taoiseach, maybe you've received it yourself. Now, we're used to ridiculous announcements from Ryanair, but this is public health that we're talking about. This isn't a gimmick. Your own minister yesterday was forced to admit that this issue around the green list is all very confusing, and it is a result of government policy. So do you share my concern that Ryanair are now using this green list to encourage people to fly to destinations that are on this list? And what action, if any, can the government take in relation to this?
Thanks very much, Deputy. No airline and no tour operator can issue travel advice on behalf of the government. The government issues travel advice, and if anyone's confused about travel advice, you go to the Department of Foreign Affairs website, and that's where you'll find travel advice. It may not be simple, but it is clear. And what we're saying to people is the safest thing is to stay at home, to stay in Ireland, and to holiday in Ireland this year. However, there is a difference between countries that have a very low level of the virus and those that don't. So if you are going to a green list country, coming back from there or coming in from there, you do not need to restrict your movements for 14 days on return. And that list will be updated every 2 weeks based on public health advice and epidemiological data. If you're coming in from countries that are not on the green list, that's the vast majority of countries in the world, including Britain, then you need to restrict your movements for 14 days. You're treated as though you were a close contact. And that means staying at home, like during the lockdown, and only going out for exercise on your own. Or to purchase essential supplies. So I hope that is clear. Every country and every jurisdiction is taking a different approach. I know in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Féin is in power, the decision has been taken to have a green list of 56 countries. Some of those countries have a much higher incidence of infection than Ireland. And of course, people
going to and from Northern Ireland from those countries could come south, and we need to bear that in mind as a risk. Deputy Alan Kelly.
Taoiseach, a couple of weeks ago I raised a very sensitive issue with you in relation to adults with intellectual disabilities. I understand that next week the families are going to protest outside here because nothing has changed. Can you imagine the most vulnerable people in our community, in our society, those with intellectual disabilities who are actually losing the will? I spoke to a mother this morning at 7:30. Her son, who's 29 years of age, had been up early. They are at their last tether. So, Taoiseach, what has happened in the last 2 weeks? I have a list here of all services across Ireland, across every CHO. There are very little services, if any, in many cases. These are the people we are leaving behind. We are really, really genuinely leaving these people behind. It's immoral. So what are we going to do to ensure their day services